Bonjour à toutes et tous, vous écoutez First Print, votre podcast comics préféré pour une émission du format Super Friends, l'émission qui va à la rencontre des personnes qui font vivre la pop culture et la culture comics par leur travail. Il s'agit d'un Super Friends VO, donc intégralement en anglais, qui sera forcément plus apprécié par nos auditeurs et auditrices anglophones. Et on espère que vous apprécierez ce travail si vous écoutez ce type de Super Friends depuis nos débuts. Au programme du jour, une discussion avec l'artiste et auteur I.N.J. Culbard, qui était venu en France à l'occasion du festival d'Angoulême en début d'année 2023, à l'occasion de la sortie de Salamandre chez 404 Comics, sa dernière production chez Bonjour Books, sachant que l'artiste avait déjà été publié chez l'éditeur avec le réussi Everything de Christopher Cantwell. Petite surprise, ce n'est pas moi-même qui conduirai l'interview, mais l'ami Corentin qui a conduit cette interview juste en amont de la venue de l'artiste au FIBD, donc sur Paris. Les deux vont retracer ensemble son parcours et aborder les nombreuses thématiques qui se cachent derrière le superbe Salamandre que l'on vous invitera à découvrir chez 404 Comics si ce n'est pas fait. À présent, place au générique, puis je vous laisse en très bonne compagnie.
All right, so we have Mr. I.N.J. Culbard here in the room with us.
Hello.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Could you pick up the mic?
Yeah.
Just like
okay.
that.
Nice to meet you too.
Nice to meet you. So, Mr. Culbard, you're here in France to promote the Salamandre book, which is out in 404 Comics, I guess.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. So, for our listeners who might not know you that well, would you mind maybe presenting yourself a little bit, your history with comic books, the way you became an artist, and I don't know, maybe some of your best memories in the field.
Do you want the long story?
I would love the long story, actually.
That's okay. I started in comic books. I used to work in film and television, and then that was going really well. And then I had a son, but I've always wanted to do comic books, I should say. And then my son was born, and just as he was born, I decided to switch to comic books. And so I started out doing stuff for Dark Horse Comics, and I tried to get a job at 2000 AD, and who I work for now, but I got a rejection letter on the day that my son was born. So because I was really happy my son was born, I looked at the rejection letter and thought, that's lovely. So it was the best day to get a rejection letter. And then after that, I think, it's a bit patchy, but I think, and then I heard about, and then I met an artist called Disraeli, Matt Brooker, who works for 2000 AD at one point, and I'd done some work, some of my own stuff, and he quite liked it, and we had a discussion about the stuff that I'd done. I said I wasn't happy with the stuff that I was done. He thought that was the perfect attitude for a comic book artist, somebody who self-critical, and so he put my name forward for a project that he wouldn't be able to do. And it was a graphic novel adaptation for Self-Made Hero in London, with I.N.J. writing the script for the picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde. And so my first proper work was a 120-page book. And so and I started on that. And from there, we did Sherlock Holmes adaptations.
The Hounds of the Baskerville?
Yeah. And then I wanted to do the Lost World adaptation. And I can remember it was, and that was something that everybody was doing. You know, everybody was trying to do Conan Doyle's Lost World. And so they said no to that. But then I looked at my bookshelf and I saw a copy of At the Mountains of Madness, and I just said, wow, that's got snow in it. So that's going to be really easy to draw, which it isn't, it turns out. And so I said, I'll do Mountains of Madness. And that's how I started doing Lovecraft adaptations, just completely by accident. And because Self-Made Hero happened to be doing an anthology series of Lovecraft stories, and they thought it would be a good idea to have a full graphic novel alongside that launch. And so they said, yeah. And then I fell into doing Lovecraft. That won an award, and then they wanted more, and the sales were really good, so I just did more of them. I did about 4 of those. And then, because I did Mountains of Madness, Dan Abnett, who's written hundreds of things, he was pitching a series he'd pitched a series to Vertigo Comics. And this is at the time when Karen Berger was there. And he thought that I.N.J were 3 different people in my name because of the amount of work I was producing at the time, because I was very prolific. And so he contacted me. I think he was relieved it's just one person, and then said he wanted to work with me on an idea for vampires and zombies series for Vertigo, which was a series called New Dead Wardians. And so that's the first time when Karen had become aware of the work that I was doing. And then I've worked with him for years now, for about 10 years. We do a series for 2000 AD called Brink. And we
Wild's End also?
Sorry?
Wild's End.
Wild's End is also, that's the other one. That's for Boom. We did another series called Dark Ages for Dark Horse. And I'm sure we've done something else, but I can't remember what, or whether we are working on something. But we've done lots of work together. And that was an amazing experience working with him. Just everybody that I've ever worked with, really, it's been always a brilliant experience. I've been very lucky, right from working with Ian Edgington and Emma Haley at Self-Made all the way through, really. And then after Wild's End, we've been doing lots of Brink. I can't think what else I've done. Oh yeah, and then in 2018, Karen Berger got hold of me at roughly the same time as I started work on the Umbrella Academy for Dark Horse. I did a spin-off book for Klaus for Dark Horse, working with Gerard Way and Sean Simon.
You Look Like Death?
Yeah. And so at exactly the same time, Karen got in touch with me. And that was a case of navigating with Dark Horse about schedules and stuff, but that was fine. And so I got to work on those 2 books at the same time as working on Brink. And so I was doing a lot of work, and then worked with her, and so we worked with Christopher Cantwell. She contacted me and said, "I'd really like to work with you on the series with Christopher Cantwell," and I said yes before looking at the script, because it's to work with Karen Berger. I've always worked with, absolutely yes. But then reading the script was fantastic. So I really enjoyed the script. So that was lucky. And then I've worked on that with her. And then when that came to a close, she then said, I think she asked me or I asked her, I can't remember who asked who, I would really like to keep working with you, because I've learned, as an artist, I've learned lots working with her. I learned a lot. I learn a lot from everybody I work with. Everything's an education. And so I said, I've got ideas for things that I want to write and draw. And so the pitching process started for Salamandre. And that was a long process. I'd pitched about 9 different ideas. I don't know if it's that many. It's a lot. And then we got to a book, and we got to an idea at one point, which wasn't Salamandre. And I worked up an outline for it, and the outline just fell apart. It just wasn't working as an idea. And then, so I thought, that's it. I've, screwed this up. So I contacted my older sister, she's a novelist and she's a playwright. And I said, how do I write something that makes people cry? So I need to know how to do this. And the advice she gave me was, take an incident from your childhood that was very dramatic, of which I've got quite a few, because I grew up in 2 different countries. I grew up behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, and I grew up in the UK, and all the stuff that happened in Poland, a lot of adventures happened when we were kids, in Poland. And so
That was around the 1780s?
Not the 1780s. No, I'm not that old. I'm old, but not that old. But no, it was in the 1980s. So 1970s and 1980s as a kid. I was in Poland up to I was there right up through Chernobyl, everything.
Okay.
So, yeah. And just in the summers, every single summer I went over from being a baby all the way up. And yeah, so things like in the book where they crossed the border, that happened. I was on a train and there's guards at those borders with guns and dogs and there's a big scene at the end of the book. And that actually did happen. That was when I was a little kid. And so I took that event as, she said, take a big event, a dramatic event from your childhood, use that as the end of the story and work backwards. So take what you know and write and start at the end. Yeah. And so I did. And so Salamandre came out of that. And I wrote the outline for Salamandre in 24 hours. And I sent it to Karen and she said yes straight away to the project. And so that's why, that's how we're here now.
Yeah. When I first started writing about the book, when it was announced by Burger Books, from the summary, I had the feeling that it was going to be a story of fantasy. Because we had this kid, Casper Salamandre, whose name evokes the mythical creature, who goes to a foreign land governed by a tyrant. Mm-hmm. So it felt like this, but actually, you describe it, from what I heard, as a misremembered version of Europe from a kid's point of view.
Yeah. So what that is like when we remember stuff, when we tell somebody something we remember, we never quite tell the same story every single time. It changes. And sometimes we'll remember bits that didn't even happen and we'll add them into the thing. I think part of the reason for that is because we're trying to convey an emotion, because memories are pretty much emotional. And so what we're trying to tell someone is how something felt. And so every time we try to say how it felt, we invent new ways of saying it. And then eventually the story falls apart. But what's true about the story is the emotion. And that's where I was really exploring to see what I could get to, emotionally in the story. The emotional truth of the story. It's a true story emotionally. But the facts are very skewed as to what happened. But it's taking actual events and just twisting them and giving you the emotional content of them rather than factual, the boring facts.
And the emotion in question is grief.
Yeah. Grief, absolutely. Yeah.
We can see how you took from your own life, the grandfather behind the veil, which is the Iron Curtain. Yeah. How do you, I don't know, you said you wanted to make people cry. You know what I'm saying?
I wanted to be able to tap into something that was worth saying.
Yeah.
And I think the thing the thing about making people cry, it's not that you want to make people cry. It's more the point that the emotional aspect of it is the true thing. It's all artists, I feel, have a duty to truth. Whether you're an actor or a writer or an artist, you're trying to show somebody what you think is real, what you think is true. And so therefore that's your objective as an artist. And so it was really to try and explore that and what that actually means, but also in terms of art, what that means in terms of artistic integrity, when working with governments that are shady governments and things like that. So it was exploring all different aspects of truth in a sense. So it was that as well. Yeah. Yeah,
because there is still this political layer around the Jaruzelski-led Poland.
That's right.
Of the time, around censorship. And I think it's weird the way you remember it with your kids' eyes.
Yeah.
Doing so, I think I remember that Karen Berger said it was like RG's version of political thrillers. Yeah. Like it was accessible to children, but the plot and the idea of totalitarianism, was really understandable to a point.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's like you said, the Jaruzelski period in history. I mean, it's exaggerated because obviously flowers weren't banned and things like that, but certain things were banned. I can remember they were definitely not legal. Yeah, absolutely. It's to try and explore the importance of art in situations like that, how important it is to have things like art. And that's relevant now. That's relevant in our world today when we have certain moves against certain artistic expression. So yeah, art is so important to everybody. The dumbing down of art and things like that, I think it's important to be able to express yourself and to be able to, yeah. Sorry, yeah, with the mic.
Because you have these stories about the paintings.
Yeah.
I have to ask, is this a true story? Is this something that...
Emotionally true.
I think you had family in the resistance.
Yes, my grandfather was in the resistance and my grandmother was as well. And they were in Warsaw. And so, but the trouble with stuff like that is when you have family that were in resistance. I also have family members that were part of the solidarity movement. Like my I don't know what level of cousin. It's like an uncle anyway, but he used to take me on marches, solidarity marches, and there was one in Gdansk that I went to, and he used to take me around Warsaw when they were delivering things using their postal service. So the underground actually had their own postal service with their own solidarity stamps and things like that. So that's where a lot of those things came from first-hand knowledge of having been there and seen those things.
The codes on the side of the stamps used by the grandfather are a reference to that?
It's a reference to it. Yeah. It's not really what happened, but it's certainly a reference to that kind of thing. And I think also my grandfather was involved in the resistance movement, but a lot of those stories from those sorts of resistance fighters, especially Poles, because after the Second World War, a lot of them were taken to the gulags because they were protesters. They were difficult. They were trouble, and so they would have been snatched up and taken away. That's partly the reason why my family ended up in England, was because to get away from that, because my grandmother was a resistance fighter, she would have ended up in prison. So that whole side of it, what you hear about is people that did heroic things, but you don't get to hear about them because they can't say what they were. So, or you'll hear certain things, certain half-truths about things. This is the other thing. It's like, what is actually true under everything that they're saying? So we'd hear lots of rumors about family members, but we couldn't I couldn't write a story about it in the real world because I couldn't substantiate any of those things. I've heard lots of stuff. There's some massive stories, but they're things that I don't feel comfortable relaying as fact. So what I was more interested in doing was looking at what the emotional content of that means. Like, what does it mean that somebody's actually done this for their family, or what did it mean that it destroyed their life, or, what sacrifices do people make? Those sorts of things, the real things that actually are the true story, the truth of the story. So that was what I was quite interested in terms of my own family's history, really.
Yeah. And you, you have this idea that the real hero in Casper's eyes is his father. Yeah. And the absence of his father leaves a whole blank that he has to explore, and being separated from him and from his context and everything. I don't know how much of yourself you put in that.
Oh, there's a lot. There's so the difference. My parents divorced. So my mother and father divorced when I was 7, I think, something like that. And because it was the 70s or the 80s, I think in 1980 at this point, I didn't get to see him again. Right, that was it. So I had no contact with him. So the fact that the father doesn't die in the story, he is trapped in a submarine. You can't reach him. That's basically, it's grief, but it's for a child, if they can't see their parent, it's just not something people recognize as grief because they just think it's divorce. Whereas actually for the child, that's grief. They're not going to see their parent again. That parent is dead to them from that day, which is terrible. And nobody comes around and says, sorry for your loss. And then he passed away when I was 27, so 20 years later. And I remember then I had people that didn't understand because they said, well, you never saw him, so it doesn't really matter. So you don't ever get sympathy like somebody who would normally lose a parent, because you're estranged from that parent for a long period of time. And then when that finishes, there's no real finality in that sense of grief. Because that's the other thing I learned about doing this book was I went to his funeral, which surprised everybody there because I look a lot like him. So they must have thought he showed up for his own funeral. But I remember being there, and afterwards there was a wake, and basically everybody at the wake was all telling stories about him. And then my dad was somebody who he used to tell big stories about things. He would exaggerate everything and tell big stories about himself. But he was a legend in that sense, like, because people used to talk about all these ridiculous, crazy things he'd do. And so, but I'd be at this funeral hearing all of these stories. And I remember thinking at the funeral, and this is what partly drove the book as well, was thinking, I don't have any stories to tell about him because I don't remember him. Yeah. And I realized at that age how important memory was, because essentially that's all you're going to leave behind for someone else. Like, we're not here for ourselves, we're here for other people, you know? And when you're gone, you're just someone else remembers. And I didn't have that for him. And I can remember that feeling was like feeling hollow at that funeral, like I had nothing there. And then when I was working on the book, for years I'd believed, I mean, I'm 50 now, for years I believed I had no memories of him. And not until I did this book did I realize I was wrong. Because as I was doing the final pages with him in it, like I was drawing the last few pages and he was there, it took me a long time. Like, normally I know how long a page is going to take. This was taking weeks. I was like, why am I not finishing these pages? And then I kept coming back and doing a little bit more, and then I go and do something else because I just jump around and do other bits of the book if I can't get this bit done. And then I came back and I wasn't finishing it. And then I realized I didn't want to stop drawing him. I suddenly realized that I did remember him. I just remembered how I felt about him. So what I was remembering was the emotion, no story, just emotion. And that's the memory I actually have of my dad. And that's not having no memory of him. You know, that's really valuable. I just walked away from doing the book and thought, okay, I get it now. I'm 50 now. I realize I actually do have memories of my dad. They're just not a story. You know, they're not something like I remember sitting on a park bench or in a car with him or anything like that. But the emotional content of it is absolutely there. I completely remember the emotion of what he means to me. Absolutely remember it. So, yeah.
Yeah, so this is like Casper doing comics about his father in the same way you're doing.
I'm doing a comic about my dad, so yeah.
But it must have been a powerful experience, though.
Yeah.
I mean,
it did, yeah.
I can imagine that having no memory and creating one from memory of the little bits you had must have been like a catharsis.
It was, yeah. So going from saying to my sister, how do I make other people cry? I'd made myself cry by the end of doing that book. But I think it was very cathartic. I think it's like really rare it must be really rare when an artist can actually reach that within them, feel that satisfied with what they've done simply because on a personal level, it means something much bigger than they thought it would do. Yeah. You know, I remember an interview where Steven Spielberg was talking to, it was an actor studio, so I've forgotten the name of the interviewer, but an actor studio interview, and the interviewer asked him about Close Encounters of the Third Kind. And he said, your mother was a musician. I think that's right. Yeah. And your father was a mathematician. How do the aliens communicate with people?
Through music. Yeah.
and through calculation of music. And Spielberg smiled and thanked him because he hadn't realized that was what he'd been doing in his work. It suddenly all clicked. And I had that when I came to the end of the book. I suddenly went, oh my God, I get why I did this now. I understand it. Because as you're working on it, it's a learning process as you do it as well. You sort of discover new things about what you're trying to say.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And I got it. I knew that it was there at the beginning. I just didn't quite see it. I'm like, I can see it now.
You had the input and you understand why you had the input.
Yeah, completely, yeah.
It's funny you were talking about Spielberg because you had the Fablemans recently where he himself explored his youth through an avatar that's not really him, but it's also factually true, emotionally true.
Oddly, exactly the same experience.
Or you had the Armageddon Time from James Gray also.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you go from there after doing that?
I know. That's the...
kind of feels like a life project, you know?
It is, yeah. I'm 50, so I've done one of those. It does feel... I mean, at the moment I'm working with Karen and trying to figure out what else to do. So I'm in that process now. I have other aspects of... You look at different aspects of your life and what certain things mean. But it's that was just me addressing my dad, which had been sitting in my head since I was 7, so it's been there all that time.
43 years in the making.
43 years in the making. That had been there a long time. But I think, you absolutely, it made me look at how I work completely differently to how I'd looked at how I worked before.
It feels different. I read some of your books, and most of what I read was, of course, taken from Lovecraft or the Sherlock Holmes guy.
I
don't know why.
Conan Doyle.
Arthur Conan Doyle. Thank you. Or the collaborations with Dan Abnett, but. I mean, I didn't know that you had this passion for writing also.
Yeah.
So I have to ask a rebound. How do you plan for a story for Salamandre in comparison to what you do when you take a book that's already there? What's the sketching process?
Well, there's one thing. Is like a little. The way to look at it is even if I'm adapting something. When I'm adapting something, I'm aware, because I believe in that whole death of the author thing, which is essentially that Roland Barthes wrote about in the 60s, which is essentially, once you've finished a book and you give it to somebody else, it's their book, right? And so what it means to that person is whatever their life, I don't think it's like this book will change your life. I think your life will change this book. So because you're reading it from a certain perspective. Now, I don't know what that's going to be. So I think by that point, when you give that book to somebody else, that's like that. So when I was adapting books, all I could say was what I thought of them when I was adapting them. So I wanted to do the Lovecraft books from my perspective so that anybody can adapt a Lovecraft book. But for it to say something coming from somewhere, then I think the author they get involved in that mix at some point. I mean, because I was looking at Baudelaire. I'm trying to think who it was. Who was Poe? Baudelaire translated Poe.
Sure, yeah.
And what you get with Baudelaire in French is largely Baudelaire, really, and a little bit of Poe. There's a lot of Poe, but essentially there's inescapable that Baudelaire is in there, And
I try to translate it, but in France we say it's les belles infidèles, which means the beautiful cheating women. It's
right.
It's not truthful a translation, but it's so beautiful what comes out that everybody agrees that it cannot be discarded.
There you go. To aim for that is no bad thing, because I think that, there's scientists tell us about the real world. I've said this numerous times, but scientists tell us about the real world and artists tell us about the worlds that they believe to be real. That's our job as artists. So I'm just telling you what I can see. So, the tree, if I see a bowl of fruit and it's just a bowl of fruit, but if I'm looking at it and thinking, the light captures it in such a way, I want you to see what I'm seeing. And you might see it or you don't. That's art, So I think it's a bit of that in there where you're just, as an artist, you're trying to explore ways to actually show what you're trying to say. And, so I think it's when adapting something, you're still coming from the same place. So as an artist, you're coming from the same place. And I think that's where it becomes worth doing as an adaptation. Because I've said this a lot in conventions and things like that, where I'm never comfortable with Lovecraft's writing, or his worldview or anything. So it was a weird one to come to, because I also feel normally quite uncomfortable with horror, but I think that because I'm uncomfortable with it, it should make you uncomfortable, right? So at the same time, and that's horror. That's what horror is. It makes you uncomfortable. And so it was an interesting thing to kind of explore. I still want to do more of that, but with my own stuff, not necessarily with Lovecraft, but I'd like to explore things that make me uncomfortable. For example, I've never seen Texas Chainsaw Massacre, because in my head, that movie is far worse than it probably is in real life.
It's actually a pretty soft movie.
Yeah. Well, in my head, it's horrific, so I'm terrified of watching it. So, but I think, those things are sort of, they're worth looking at. How you see the world is essentially what you're doing as an artist. So, yeah, I think, but adapting, a lot of the work is already done for you because the person's written the story. Charles Dexter Ward, which I adapted, that had a great plot that he did all the work on that. I didn't have to worry about the plotting at all. What I decided to explore in that was the horror of losing someone to dementia. So I read a lot of reports on the bereavement that the parent feels or loved ones feel when somebody loses their mind, essentially. So they're not there, or they lose all their memories. So I used to research a lot of things medically to tap into something that I could understand. Hold on a second.
No, that's mine.
Is that you?
Yeah.
I was just checking it wasn't me.
Don't worry.
So looking at lots of things like medical reports and stuff like that. To really get, because you can find real horror. There's horrible things right there about the whole thing. I mean, the way that I looked at the stories that he presented, the ones that I decided to adapt, he was talking very much about the horrors of you personally. I always thought that I think it's Stephen King said something like, the ghosts and the monsters are in your own head. And I was quite interested in exploring that and seeing what disturbed me, because they're my ghosts and they're the things that horrify me, but they're bound to horrify somebody else as well at the same time. So you're going to hit an audience at some point, but you'll be able to explore certain things that you find horrific. And so they tended to be more kind of introspective, I think, than they probably were on paper, So, but again, like I did, the other one I did was The King in Yellow.
King in Yellow, yeah.
Yeah. Which I forgot that I did, actually. But that's another one I did. Yeah. It was like, no, it's New York. It's in Washington Square in New York and set in Paris as well. So it's like, and I can remember going through the book, and they were all short stories. And what I did differently with that was connect them, because there is actually a through line. There's a very thin connection between the stories, really thin. And I wanted to make it was only the ones that were relevant to The King in Yellow, because it's about 9 stories, the original book. Only about 4 or 5 of them, or 6 of them maybe, are actually King in Yellow stories. And so I kind of fashioned a graphic novel out of that, So that was the first one where I took a lot of liberties, but I'd been taking liberties since I did At the Mountains of Madness. At the Mountains of Madness is not like, it cuts out lots of the stuff that happens at the beginning, because at the beginning of that book, it's a very boring, sounds terrible. I found it boring. It's a really long, drawn out travelogue of mountains. And it's like, what? But that made me think, like, this is almost like if you opened up a Tintin book and then you turn to you're reading it, and it's an adventure, and it's a boy's own adventure like Tintin. But then you get halfway through and you'll turn the page and someone's cut Captain Haddock right in half, and I thought, that's great, and I'll just do it like this. And so that's
exactly the feeling I got when I read Mountains. That there's this scene where they're talking on the radio, and there's a guy that's behind the speaker, and he just looks silently
Yeah.
And there's no bubble and for float balloons.
Yeah.
And I was like, wow, this is chilling. This is like, because it looks like RG.
Yeah.
But I know it's horror. I know it's Lovecraft.
Yeah.
I know it's a crazy world.
Yeah.
So just the silent scene made me like, oof, this is uncomfortable.
Well, I mean, if you took something like I.N.J, and the funny thing is that after I'd done that book, somebody then produced a bunch of covers. They did a whole bunch of I.N.J covers, but they were Cthulhu. Kind of like somebody did Mountains of Madness, but like a Tintin at the Mountains of Madness, I think, something like that. So the vibe was in the zeitgeist somewhere. So that was mad. But because that came out pretty much when the book was published, it came out at the same time, I think, or something like that. So someone else somewhere else was thinking the same thing. Isn't it weird if we did like a Tintin, Mountains of Madness? But I do think it's like that. When you read the book originally, it's just talking about it in the way that I.N.J would write. Like he'd kind of have like almost like a sort of a documentary type approach, especially in his drawings when they were sort of, all his reference material was exquisite. I also love the fact that's the other thing. Lovecraft never went anywhere that he was writing about. I.N.J never went to the places he wrote about because they were just in a filing cabinet. He had all those filing cabinets full of little sketches and newspaper articles. And so I quite like that parallel between the two. I thought that was quite cool. But that's a long time ago now, over 10 years ago.
Do you still feel the influence of guys like I.N.J or Mézières?
Yeah. I mean, there were people that I read when I was a kid, and I kind of like the flat color, and but I also like the Japanese. There's a Japanese print movement called Shinhanga, which was in the Yoshida is one of the more popular ones of that run. But they're gorgeous prints that were done in, I've forgotten the year, the turn of the previous century. I can't remember what the date is. But so that's an influence as well. So it's not just I.N.J, but I do love the flat color in all of that. And I love the approach to the line work. The Linclair is definitely an influence, I think. And it's something I strive to. I mean, I have very shaky hands, so it's like Linclair for me is an achievement. So that's what it is, I guess. But
I'm asking you because we didn't mention it in the podcast yet. We did early on before we started the recording. But there's a lot of French elements in Salamandre. You're pronouncing the name Salamandre on purpose. It's mostly French names. When you read it in English, it's mostly French colloquialism, like they say oui, they say bonjour, etc., etc. And
qu'est-ce que c'est knuckle sandwich?
And you explained to me that it was because you felt less divided between your cultures from the French perspective.
So I grew up English and Polish in the UK. But I grew up in a Polish house. I didn't grow up in an English house. So all of the culture in the house I didn't understand was actually Polish. So when I used to go to English kids' houses, I'd go in and say, "Where's all your stuff?" Because it was the cultural aspect on top of English stuff. So you'd have like wooden, we had effigies and things like that, Polish stuff all over the place. And it was just a bit weird that other houses didn't have that, but there was also, so I wasn't really quite aware that I was kind of growing up in a slightly different culture to everybody else. But also other kids would immediately, if they knew that I was half Polish, I mean, I was born in Greenwich, but that made me Polish. Like, you're not even English, you're Polish. It's like that. You're immediately something else. And when I was in Poland, other kids would go, "You're English." So I didn't feel particularly like I've never felt English or Polish. I felt both, but the idea of both is something that a lot of people don't understand. They want you to either be one thing or the other. But the brilliant thing was when I traveled down at the age of 19, I think I was, and I traveled to the Ardèche Valley, and I was helping build a house there. And there I was just foreign. And that for the first time in my life, I was just one thing, and it was accurate. So that was it. It was amazing. So I fell in love with it. I fell in love with I didn't have any grasp of French. but it didn't matter. You know, I was working with French builders, and we had a really good time. I really enjoyed the change. It had a real effect. So I loved it.
You know, it's funny because I feel like your art style is in himself foreign.
Yeah.
You know, like it kind of looks like European comics.
Yeah.
But you've got this use of color and of découpage, breakdowns. That feels really American. And you have these American settings like in Celeste on the highway. And you have everything which is really American in the sense that it's a little American town. It's the supermarket. And yet it always feels a bit hybrid. You know what I'm saying? In the influences when you can look at things like I.N.J, or maybe, I don't know, maybe if Magnolia is an influence of yours. And it doesn't really feel like, especially in Salamandre, which is based in Europe, it doesn't really feel like it's only an American or British full-on comics. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah. I think even with 2000 AD, the very first time they did an article on me, because usually when they get a new artist, they run an article on the new artist in Judge Dredd magazine that comes out every month. And they did one on me, and the title was, now I'm born in England, but the title said Euro Smash. Right? Technically, it's accurate. I am technically European because my blood right is my dad was born in the UK, and the blood right in the UK is your father, and your blood right in Poland is your mother. So I am technically European. Right? So that's right. But it was funny because it's like it's immediately recognized as European. But I have that quite a bit. I think when I first had books coming out here in France, I think as well because of having the surname Culbard or Culbard, people actually thought I was French. So and I've had that quite a few times. And then I wondered if because I'd done a book that was partly in French, people would assume that I was French. But
it's but part of the reason even more.
Yeah, but part of the reason for doing it was because the reason for doing it was because I'm bilingual. I actually speak Polish, not very well anymore because I've not spoken it for a lot of years, but I mostly speak English. But as my family would probably tell you, when my kids were growing up, they said, we never heard you swear. And I said, no, I never did swear in English. I'd always swear in German or Polish. But I think it's like, so I grew up with two different languages going on in my head. And I had somebody ask me once, what's that like when you speak Polish? Do you sort of translate it in your head? I said, no, it's just you have more of a vocabulary. It's just a bigger vocabulary. You just use different words. You know, I mean, when I go into a supermarket in the UK, I can't remember. I remember now because I'm recording, but I think it's right. Blueberries, they're like little blue berries. Well, yeah, blueberries. Okay. But in my head, they got this. So they're not, I don't remember the actual word in English. I remember the word in Polish, but not in English. So there's some things that I forget in English. So, but I wanted to do a book because, like this, because of the fact with the language is because, the English, I wanted to point out just how many words the English speak that is actually French.
Okay.
Because English is a bilingual language. I mean, it's a trilingual language. So it already, if I said to you in English, vocabulaire français, I don't have to translate that to another English person. They already know that I've just said French vocabulary because they're familiar with the terms. Lots of stuff like that, from nécessaire, necessary, confortable, comfortable. So it's not a stretch. You know, so I looked at it and just thought, right. I remember the scene in Shawshank Redemption. It's the scene in the library. Yeah. And they're sitting there and the guy on the ground is reading the book. One of my favorite books. He said, Alexandre dumbass. he said, this is right. And then they correct him and this is Count of Monte Cristi. Like that. And what I did was I called this Dumas Français because another favorite of mine because I read quite a lot of Dumas when I was younger. There's a D'Artagnan book, and in D'Artagnan he actually says English is nothing but badly pronounced French. which I thought, this is great. So I'm going to use it in the same way. So that's basically why the world is a sort of mix between English and French. It's accentuating the French that's already exists in England, in the English language. And that's really, like I say, du ma français. It's like because I was also aware of in the 60s, there was this whole thing about franglais, which is taking English words and making them French. I didn't want to do that. And I understand the whole idea of preserving language because of the internet age, using things like password and things like that. I understand those discussions. So I really wanted to find a way to take English and go, these are French words. All right.
And regarding the architecture and the backgrounds of panels, you have the first city in Montparnasse, which looks like a fisherman's city, like it's on top of the sea. And then you have which I'm assuming is a Polish traditional landscape.
Well, it's an Eastern Bloc. It's like a very hard brutalist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And part of the reason for the brutalist culture is there was in the 1960s, there's an English writer, J.G. Ballard, who was very against the concreting of London. So we had very brutalist architecture in the 1960s in the UK. And obviously there's a lot of brutalism in Soviet architecture. And the way that I look at it, I like brutalism. I think it looks beautiful, in the shapes and things, but it does destroy history. It eradicates any sense of the past in that place, or any kind of, it kind of almost eradicates culture in that sense in those places. And I like the fact that I was able to utilize some of that in this, because there's a stark contrast between traditional buildings and then a big granite concrete block.
When it works with the 1984 allegory with the
absolutely
emperor, etc.
Yeah. They sort of drain the beauty out of the world. I mean, at the same time, it's difficult because I quite like brutalism. So I think it looks astonishing sometimes. Very sci-fi. It's mainly because, the new series Andor, they filmed that in many of the, in the UK, and many of the brutalist kind of buildings, like the Barbican Centre, which is a kind of a 60s building. And they filmed it in those kind of locations. So, but to me, it also means it means sci-fi from the 60s. So I quite like the look of it in a way. But it does kind of just mean it's like a tabula rasa. They completely got rid of the history of this place and they built their own stark thing,
And yet it has a counterpoint that they eradicated flowers.
Yeah.
And there's this, I'm assuming it works in the allegory of grieving, because the plants grow back. That's what the character of the grandpa says. I think it was really actually a beautiful landscape regarding the propos, the speech, the discourse on totalitarianism that you choose to demonstrate. I mean, it does have a contrast in terms of structures.
Yeah.
But I mean, people there seem like they are finding happiness in community, and they're still growing flowers illegally, and you still have artists that are protesting the government, and it doesn't feel like it's really like depressing. I don't know if it's clear. On what you remember from it.
Yeah, when I was so those blocks, the famous like Eastern block houses, the big apartment ones that everybody remembers, that imagery. One of my uncles that was the Solidarity guy that I used to travel around with, he lived in one of those. And when you went in them, they're scary looking buildings and there's nothing growing around them. It looks like nothing could grow there. And we went in and we went up in the elevator, and it's this big, loud metal elevator, and you go up to the top floor where he lived, and we'd go in. And the moment you walked into the house, the warmth of the family and their culture and everything that they had, the smell of the cooking or anything, it's their home. It's their small piece of dignity that they have in this place because of the fact that everything else outside looks quite stark. But here it feels like home, and the love in all of that as well. So it needed to, what I was remembering, especially when he gets to the house of his, Maison de Chance, when he goes to his aunt's, second cousin's place or first cousin's place. When he goes to her house, that sense of everything is around the kitchen, and the kitchen table. And so the whole family sort of orchestrates around that, So yeah, I definitely wanted to get that warmth back in there, despite what was outside it. And that building as well, that's an old building, still happens to be standing because they couldn't bomb it because it just missed every time. So the whole neighborhood is flat and has these like mid-century modern buildings in there, but that's the only one that's actually the old original. And just by chance it's there. That's all. Yeah.
For the portraits of the upper and of the other portrait, I'm not going to spoil it. You use the painting technique.
Yeah.
The same way that sometimes you change your style for everything during the commercial sequence. What's the specific idea of that?
I needed a sort of artistic identity for Mélisson's paintings that wasn't like mine. So I needed to figure
out. Is Mélisson based on somebody actually?
Yes. Yeah. Okay. There was a, but very vaguely. So my only memory of the woman that she's based on is that she would paint our portraits and we would go to her place to have them painted. I can remember these tall shutter doors in this place and there were cats everywhere. So when you went to sit down on your chair to be painted, there would be a cat there. Every time you went to take the cat off, there'd be another one there. So it was a nightmare. So, it was very much, the rest of her character is actually every art teacher that I ever had, all the good ones. So they were all the good art teachers and the advice I've had over the years that she is an element of those characters, So yeah.
So sorry, I interrupted you. You were talking about her paintings and technique.
I just tried to figure out how she would work that would be different to how I was working. So it would stand out that it was like a different image on the page. There's a different artist's view. Because that whole thing about art is how I see the world. I had to try and think, how would Mélisson see the world? So her artwork wouldn't be like mine, except it's me creating it. But it would have to be different to the other art. Yeah. And it would have to look like artwork as well. Yeah.
Okay. Regarding the rest of the casting, I guess you would say, so the grandfather is mostly based on your grandfather?
Absolutely, to a T, 100%.
Your mother is your mother also, I guess?
No.
No?
No, she's quite different.
She's quite different, okay.
No, that's a whole different thing. But my dad is essentially built from other people's memories, really, and from the stories that I heard
in the album, actually.
Yeah,
he does look
just like that. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, and around the the cultural differences, I feel like there's a change in color also before and after the veil. Yeah, like it's actually a bit of a colder coloring in the Montparnasse Dawn. And the warmth seems to grow back eventually in the book. And you're well known for your use of the way you apply color. Is that a specific? Because you said you discovered the book meantime. So did you always feel like it had to be a bit colder in the beginning and then gradually warmer as Casper rebuilds himself?
Basically, exactly that.
Okay.
Yeah. Slowly and surely over the course of the whole book. Yeah. It kind of shifts very subtly, and but the idea being that that stuff will exist anyway. I mean, it will work its way through. I think because the metaphor of the flower always works. It's essentially what that is. That's us as people as well. Generally speaking, we grow back to some degree,
And so now that you've grown back, where do you see yourself flowering?
Oh, God. Well, I'm figuring that bit out next, I think. It was an experience doing it. I'm really glad I did it. It's something that I've been working towards for a lot of years and trying to figure lots of things out. Even from doing the Lovecraft books, I was always more interested in why am I doing this? Why is it my what is it that I'm seeing here, and all this kind of stuff. This just solidified all of that. So it's made me, now when I'm pitching, I'm more interested in certain things that are very specific now. Not necessarily that there would be another Salamandre book or anything like that. It would be, it could be anything, but the focus is in a very particular keen place now in the way that I want to be able to tell stories, I think.
Do you feel like you could be collaborating with other writers as well as before without putting your own input on the writing?
Well, when I work with Dan, we always work, because before I did comic books, I used to work in film and TV. So I used to write for television. And so I've always had a writer's perspective on stuff when it comes to the story. And so when Dan and I work together, we break the story together. We're called breaking the story together, but we sit down and figure out the whole thing with each other. And then we'll have input. So the whole way through, but we'll only talk about it like writers, because I mean, even when I'm writing the book, I don't think about the drawing at all until I sit down and have to draw it. Once the script is done, then I look at it as an artist picking up a script. So I can sit there and complain. But when I'm sitting with Dan, oftentimes we collaborate as much as we can all the way through, because we both see it as a collaborative medium from start to finish. But that means that there's a bit of jamming going on as well. So a bit like musicians just rocking out a little bit. We have moments where I'll come up with an idea midway through while drawing, and he'll work that into the script. And likewise, he'll work something into the script later on that wasn't in the original proposal, and I'll work that into the artwork subtly in the background. And we sort of work like that. So we're kind of live all the time when we work on something. But that makes it so it's not really that different than when writing for myself, because I approach those problems. The only thing is with Dan, I get to bounce the idea off someone immediately. He's right there. But, and I often, when working with Dan, he has strengths where I have weaknesses, and vice versa. So basically, I can come up with the high concept and he can come up with the low concept and make it realistic. So he can bring the crazy thing and pull it down so that it actually works logically, and things like that. So the way we work together is integral. It's kind of, we're very mixed.
This band will not split.
Huh?
This band will not split.
No, we have a thing where in the collaboration, so there was a rule that we set up really early on, which was, if I have an idea and I love my idea, and he has an idea and he loves his idea, we accept that we are both wrong. Right? There is a third idea just to one side we're not seeing, and we just can't see it. And because we've worked that way, every time we've gone, oh, that's the third idea, right? This is we accept that we're going to kill the idea that we've both got, and we're going to go for the third idea. We always do it. And it ends up being something that would not have ever existed if it wasn't for the fact that he was working on it and I'm working on it. That's the exciting thing of working in an idea space and seeing things together and going, oh, we're going to use this because this is it's got to be this. And figuring that out is it's brilliant. So your egos have to be completely outside the room when you're working. You have to allow for the artists to kind of just get on with it, because the ego's the enemy, as I say. It's terrible, but you can't be egotistical when you're working with somebody at all. You've got to allow to the possibility of anything could happen. To see where it could go. And I'm able to do that, very fortunate, able to do that with him, loads. It's great. So it's a really good working relationship.
Yeah. And so on the next project.
Yeah. Would it be working with him or?
I don't know, maybe you have some.
Well, we're still doing Brink.
Yeah.
We still do that. And we also have a ton of ideas locked up that we have these sessions we called omelette sessions, because it's about putting every single egg into the thing and anything else you can find. So we have these omelette sessions where we come up with about 6 or 7 different projects.
Okay.
And so we got a ton of stuff to work on together. And then, but also at the same time, I'm continuing to work with Karen on my own stuff separately.
Yeah, like all the ideas you scrapped, maybe one of them will regrow.
Yeah, it can happen that way.
Okay.
Yeah, it can be something like that. But with Karen, I quite like coming up with something new every single time. So it ends up being hundreds of ideas. Right? When I worked in TV, there was one time when I was asked to write ideas for episodes, and before the weekend, and just little tiny small ideas for episodes, and I misheard them when they told me on Friday night to go away how many they wanted. So I came in on Monday with 36 ideas, and they said, "This is great, but we asked for 6." So coming up with, and I've used most of those 30 ever since then, the ones that I didn't use in there. I just went, "Oh, this is great. I've got loads of them I can use for other stuff." And in some ways I can throw those in when I have omelette sessions talking to Dan Abnett. I take a lot of those ones still, because there's loads of them, 30. Like that can last you for years. But yeah, I like to, if something's not working when pitching with Karen, I'm quite happy to drop that idea and go get another one and come back with something fresh every single time. I sort of think if something's not working, because the idea is only part of it. Ideas are 2 a penny. You can come up with hundreds of ideas. The execution is the important part. How you put it together is the really important bit, and what it means and how you pull all those things together. So yeah, I love the whole process, because it's like a really satisfying jigsaw puzzle when you're putting things together. It's really good fun to do. I was doing that over the Christmas holidays. So everybody else was doing stuff, and in the house I have these like boards that I pin things onto, and I was pinning together this whole like really complicated 5-act structure story together over the holidays. But I just love doing it. So I have little Post-it notes that go onto these boards, because I like moving stuff around. I also like just writing things randomly on paper, chucking it in the air and seeing which one lands first, and go, we'll start there. That's where the beginning of the story is. Anything that's experimental like that is great. You know? I mean, it's easy enough. It's like that to get it started, I think. Because I have the magic broken box method, which is like, if you had like a magic broken box at the start of the story, then obviously the rest of the story is how you fix the story. If the magic broken box is in the middle of the story, then the magic broken box worked beforehand and now it doesn't. Is it about fixing it, or did it need something else? And if the magic broken box is at the end of the story, then it needed to be destroyed from the beginning. So it's always good to then have an idea in place of the word magic box, and then place it somewhere in that structure, beginning, middle, or an end, and then go, all right, we'll start here. This is where it breaks. What happens? Why did it, what was this? And that's a good way to get into a story. And I love doing that lots. So yeah, I can sit here all day doing that. Yeah.
That's great. I have just 2 last questions. You said that, you quoted earlier, the fact that when you give your book to somebody, it's theirs. Salamandre is out now in the US. It's going to be out soon in France. Did you have a response from the public, and were you happy or sad with it?
No, it's good. It's been really good. It's been really good positive feedback. I was really surprised because it came out on the 22nd of December. It was delayed coming from the printers. Interestingly, it got delayed at customs. So a book that's about censorship got delayed in China because they had to inspect the book to see if the map was okay. And I thought, that's great. I've literally, so that's the reason the American printing was so late, because it was partly that. It's also the paper shortages and everything else that's going on in the world at the moment. And, but yeah, it was, it got delayed. So it came out just before Christmas, and I thought, okay, it's not going to make any end of year lists at all. And it did. It made the end of year list for the Forbes. And Publishers Weekly, it got an honorable mention in there. So, and the reactions have been fantastic. And I had quite a few interviewers that were saying that they cried reading it. So thank you to my sister for for that.
Goal achieved.
Yeah, there you go. Done it now. You can go home. But so, and just, I was speaking to someone yesterday that said that they cried. I said, well, sorry, but I'm also really pleased. They cried reading it. But what was great was they'd read the English version, so they got to appreciate the actual language thing that was going on in it.
That was my follow-up question. We've had in France some positive feedback on everything.
Yeah.
Which actually sound really well for a graphic novel in this country. And I seem to remember when we had Karen Berger on the podcast, that she said she was really like happy with the format and the choices that were made by the editor. I wanted to have your opinion on that, on everything, and on Salamandre, which I have to admit I didn't see actually in its French version so far.
Oh, in terms of what I think of the French editions?
Yeah.
I was bowled over when I saw. Do you know something really simple is those dots on the spine of the cover? That's amazing to me. when I saw that, it's like, why didn't I think of that? That's incredible. They're really nice. Like when we got the book, one is also the texture of the book as well. I mean, the great thing about it is the fact that books are a tactile medium, and these are definitely tactile books. And then the thing that astonished me as well was how big Salamandre was when I saw it. Like it's a proper album size, it's that really surprised me. And then I felt the book, and that just feels amazing. The canvas binding on the canvas cover on the book was incredible. So I really like it. And I was frightened at first because when you do a book, you kind of think, oh, it's going to be small, so I'm going to draw it like this. And I was a bit worried. But it's like, now it's like HD. It's like really big. But actually it works really well. I was really surprised. I got no problems with that at all. I was really, really pleased. So okay. I thought when I saw it, I thought, hold on, is this like a one-off or they've done a big version? But no, that's the whole book.
Yeah, this is one of the good things we have in France.
That's great. Really like it. So and it works well. It works really well in terms of it being translated. And well, I can't speak to the translation really because I'm English, but but yeah.
Well, okay, thanks a lot, I.N.J.
Merci.
Merci à vous. Donc voilà, merci de nous avoir écoutés jusqu'au bout. Donc Salamandre sera disponible au mois de mars aux éditions 404 Comics. Everything est déjà disponible si vous ne l'avez pas encore lu. Vous avez une critique sur le site comicsblog.fr. En attendant, vous pouvez nous retrouver sur tous les médias d'écoute de podcast ainsi que sur la plateforme Tipeee. Et on remercie ceux qui s'abonnent régulièrement. Voilà, bon festival d'Angoulême, merci à tous et à bientôt. Bye bye.